Alright guys, so here's our first video discussion, which I'll post several of these in the next couple of days. Today's going to be Peter Singer and animal ethics, and then we'll look at Bonnie Steinbach's response, and then I'll post a review for the final. So just getting into it right away, Peter Singer is a utilitarian philosopher, as you should remember. He's looking at animal rights insofar as what we as humans have an obligation to do to protect animals and where they would get those rights from. And we can look at, in general, indirect versus direct duty towards animals. Direct duties towards animals themselves would be considering animal welfare as like an intrinsic good, which is sort of a deontological idea, and an indirect duty would be to act certain ways towards animals for the sake of ourselves, which would be more of the anthropocentric perspective. The ethical status for animals, from a utilitarian standpoint, we'd be looking at pleasure and pain of conscious beings, which is known as sentience, the ability to be able to experience pain. And that's really the focus of Singer's whole argument. He sees ethics as like an evolving discipline. In the past, people have been mistreated throughout history, and protective rights have been extended to all forms of people as Western civilization has advanced, and he talks briefly about how that still needs to continue and grow, but for the most part, any type of all of the isms essentially are not considered to be acceptable generally by any given culture or society, Western society at large, even though there are obviously still issues with regard to that. But so he said that as far as we've come with regard to equal protection for human beings, there's still one sort of ism, which he refers to, that is widely accepted and widely practiced, that is culturally accepted as a norm, and that's what he calls speciesism. And that's something that he's trying to eradicate through his animal liberation. So he talks about how we routinely grant importance to the interests of human beings on borderline cases, but not full rights. Like, not everybody has the right to drive a car or own a house. Those are like extensions of rights that can be granted or accessed. So they're not full rights. But we do grant all humans in general, and this is a generalization, as being morally important. And most human beings in most societies have the right to not be mistreated. He recognizes that animals aren't morally equivalent to like human beings insofar as all of the various rights that may be afforded to them, but there's no good reason, he says, why we shouldn't extend the rights to not be morally mistreated to animals, because they are similar in the most important way insofar as they have sentience, which is the capacity for suffering. So we don't discriminate between people on the basis of intelligence or ability. Therefore, we shouldn't discriminate against animals for similar reasons. For example, a dog can't read or write. It doesn't have the ability to drive a car or work a job. Well, some animals can work jobs if they're service dogs, right? But animals have the capacity to suffer, and therefore, because of that sentience, they should have a moral protection to not be made to suffer needlessly. And that's really the crux of his argument. But what we end up with here from a utilitarian perspective, because again, we're looking at sentience as the capacity to suffer, its conscious awareness of one's own suffering. We have sort of a sliding scale based on the mammalian brain development, starting there. Consciousness involves the biological aspects of how the brain is developed, and you can look at various animals that have varying degrees of sentience. And we've talked about that in the last class, where we look at, like, an adult pig has a tremendous amount of sentience, but yet obviously pigs are used for food and eaten regularly. Obviously dogs and so forth. And we looked at the sort of arbitrary element in class regarding how we sort of grant certain rights to animals based on our sort of not well thought out preference. Like, for example, an adult pig has this higher degree of sentience than an adult dog, but yet we treat adult dogs much different than we would treat an adult pig, because they're our friends and we don't particularly prefer the taste of their flesh. And this is something that Peter Singer highlights as being sort of a contradictory aspect to the treatment of animals, and it's also not anything that can be really defended argumentatively, other than just us saying, well, that's what we do because we like it, or that's what we're used to doing. So that's sort of the gist of the Peter Singer position on animal rights, that basically the more sentient the being is, the greater protection they should have, the greater moral protection or moral status, we would say, to not be made to suffer. So what we're going to look at next, in the next clip, I'm going to talk about Bonnie Steinbach's response to Peter Singer's argument. And I think she makes a pretty interesting contribution. She's agreeing with a certain element of it, but saying that it kind of goes too far, and that there are other qualities that we need to look at, and other attributes in terms of what gives a person a right and a moral protection. So I hope this makes sense. I'll be in touch soon with more videos. All right, take care.